All right, folks, in this last lesson for Unit 2, what we're going to talk about is short-run equilibrium in the aggregate market. In the last lesson, we talked about long-run equilibrium. Now we're going to go into short-run equilibrium. Now, one of the things that we said in the last lesson was we said that we learned about the three curves that are represented in the aggregate market graph: short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long-run aggregate supply. And we put them together on one graph, and one of the things that we said is that there's three possible situations when you put all three curves on the graph at the same time. And the one that we looked at last time was where the market equilibrium, where the short-run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves, where their equilibrium point right there, where they intersect, ran right over the long-run aggregate supply curve. And what we said is that this circumstance is referred to as long-run equilibrium in the economy. And so what we're going to talk about today is short-run equilibrium and the issues associated with inefficiencies, or I don't know, gaps is what we're going to say, gaps in short-run equilibrium. Okay, so we said the other two possibilities are where the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand occur either to the left or to the right of long-run aggregate supply, and that's going to be the major focus of our lesson today. Okay, but the first thing I want to do is I want to give you a definition for short-run equilibrium. Before I give you that definition, I want to tell you that you already know what short-run equilibrium is. We have been using it for several lessons now. We just haven't been calling it short-run equilibrium. And basically, the idea is this, is where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect. We've been calling this the equilibrium of the aggregate market. But that actually is what we call short-run equilibrium, where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect with each other. That is short-run equilibrium in the aggregate market. And so our definition here for short-run equilibrium is going to be the aggregate market equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply which determines the price level and real GDP in an economy, and determines the business cycle over time. And here's what I mean by determines the business cycle over time. This aggregate market here, where we have the short-run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves, and where they intersect and determine the price level and real GDP here, this is not, time is not represented in this graph. The only things represented in this graph are quantity, which is real GDP, and the price level in the economy. And so anytime we see short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand here, they're frozen. This is a snapshot. It's like taking a picture of the economy in one moment. This is a single instance or a single instant in the economy. But over time, we know that the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right and the left, and the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right and to the left. And so we know that over time, in one moment, real GDP is right here, but let's say a month later, when there's a change in aggregate demand, let's say aggregate demand has increased. Now look what has happened to real GDP. We have had a slight increase in real GDP, and now we have real GDP prime. So we've had an increase in real GDP. Well, the way that would look on the business cycle would look like this. So this is real GDP over time. And at one particular moment, real GDP is, let's say, here, And then a little while later, real GDP has increased. It's moved over to the right. Well, moving to the right on this graph, that's an increase. But real GDP here is on a vertical axis, therefore real GDP is moving up. This curve, this aggregate demand curve, moved over to the right over time, a month later. So now, a month later, and real GDP has gone from here up to here, and so now a month later, real GDP is going to be at this point. And what's happening is you can see now that there was an increase in real GDP. Now we know that the business cycle, I'm going to draw a sketch, just a representation of the business cycle. We know that the business cycle over time has fluctuations. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, right? And here's what I'm saying, is that this business cycle is drawn by, meaning it's written down. All of these little, this is a whole bunch of little points that are all squished together over time. And over time, what we have is, here's a supply and a demand curve, aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, another aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and all along here, over time is short run aggregate supply curves and aggregate demand curves, drawing the business cycle over time as it goes. And so the business cycle is basically a drawing of short-run equilibrium as it moves right and left over time. And so what's happening here is basically you have to almost think of it sort of this direction. With real GDP horizontally, we have sometimes up here, the curve has moved this way, that's up. But on the aggregate demand curve, up is to the right. And here, when it moves from here down to here, that's a downward motion of real GDP, which is actually a leftward motion here. Now, it looks really confusing now. If you don't fully understand this, that's okay. I'm actually going to show you a different representation of short-run equilibrium using only the aggregate market graph. But what I'm saying here is that you need to understand that the business cycle is the result of the aggregate market graph intersection, the equilibrium, the real GDP from the equilibrium changing over time and fluctuating up and down and up and down and up. Okay, that's where the business cycle comes from. So, short-run equilibrium is the aggregate market equilibrium that determines the business cycle over time. Okay? All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and draw the other two possibilities that we could experience in the aggregate market. And so we're going to draw aggregate market here, we're going to put real GDP here, and we're going to put price level here. And then here, we're going to draw, same thing, real GDP and price level here. And what we said is we're going to put all three curves on both of these graphs. So these are two different circumstances. So I'm going to draw a long run aggregate supply curve here. And over here I'm going to draw another long run aggregate supply curve. And in one circumstance, the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand occurs on the left side. There's short-run aggregate supply, and then here's aggregate demand. And the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is on the left side of long-run aggregate supply. Where over in this circumstance, we're going to draw a short-run aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve. And there you can see that the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the short-run equilibrium, is to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay? And so these two circumstances, we have names for these, and I'm going to give them to you in just a minute. Previously, when we said long-run equilibrium, we talked about a situation where the intersection occurred on top of long-run aggregate supply. And so when you see that circumstance, that's called long-run equilibrium. But I need you also to be able to recognize what's going on in these two circumstances. So what I'm going to go ahead and put on here is, I'm going to bring down real GDP. So short-run equilibrium determines the price level and real GDP in an economy. So this is short-run real GDP, or actual output in the economy. And then it also determines the price level, which we'll put CPI. And then over here, it's the same thing. At the equilibrium, at short-run equilibrium, we're going to determine real GDP in the economy, short-run, and we're going to determine CPI in the economy. And as you can see here, you can have a circumstance where real GDP is over on the right-hand side of long-run aggregate supply, and over here, real GDP is on the left of long-run aggregate supply. But look, CPI is about the same for both of them. So CPI is reasonably independent in this circumstance. Okay? All right, so now what I'm going to say is this. What level of GDP is occurring at long-run aggregate supply? Well, recall, when the amount of output is equal to long-run aggregate supply, we call that natural real GDP. Natural real GDP. And so over here, this point right here, this amount of output is natural real GDP. Okay? And so now let's have a conversation about the differences, and we need names for this. Now, I want you to know that you have already learned about this, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a third graph over here. I'm going to draw the business cycle over time. And so we're going to put time here. And on the vertical axis, we're going to put real GDP. And I'm going to put two curves here. I'm going to put the long-run aggregate supply curve, or I'm going to put the natural real GDP curve, which we learned is a stable line that's increasing over time. And that is natural real GDP, which is also the long-run aggregate supply curve over time. And then I'm going to draw the business cycle, which is going to, let's say I'll start right here, and I'll go like this. And that is the business cycle, or I'm going to call it short run GDP, real GDP. Okay, short run real GDP, or actual production in the economy. All right, which is also the business cycle. Now, we learned a few lessons ago about this situation. We learned about a circumstance where real GDP is higher than natural real GDP. So at this particular time, let's call this time A. At time A, this point right here, that's natural real GDP at a particular at time A. But short-run GDP at time A is up here. In fact, that looks like it's a peak in the business cycle. That's actual real GDP at time A. All right? And you can see here, at time A, real GDP is larger than natural real GDP. So at time A, real GDP is greater than natural real GDP. And what we said is that there's a name for that circumstance when actual output in the economy is larger than the normal output in the economy, and we called that an inflationary gap. An inflationary gap. Oops, that's not a very good G there. Let's fix that G there. There we go. This whole region here, any time that this gap here, when real GDP exceeds natural real GDP, output is too high. We are overproducing in the economy. We're producing too much. In fact, and I was thinking about that subject again because I know that we talked about it in I think the last lesson or maybe the lesson before. You might not be fully convinced that it's a bad thing to overproduce in the economy. So I came up with another analogy. Think about a car engine. If you drive, when you're looking at your instrument panel and you're driving, you know, there's a speedometer and that tells you how fast you're going, but there's another one called a tachometer. And what it tells you is revolutions per minute. It tells you how hard your engine is working. And there's a little red section near the top around like maybe 6,000 or 7,000 RPMs. Now, when you normally drive down the highway, you might do about maybe 2,500 or 3,000 RPMs. That is the normal output for your engine. That's the normal amount of work for your engine. But when you want to get a burst of speed, you put your foot down on the accelerator really hard and your tachometer, the RPMs, shoots up into the 6,000 and you get a burst of energy and your car just takes off and you get a big burst of speed. But you can't do that consistently. You can't move that tachometer up into 6,000 and 7,000 RPMs in the long term. You can't make a 10-hour drive at 6,000 RPMs. It would damage your engine. It would overwork your engine. Your engine is not designed to operate at that many RPMs in the long run. It can only handle it in the short run. It's the exact same sort of thing. This inflationary gap is basically the same idea as overworking your engine. You are running the RPMs up into 6,000 and 7,000. When natural real GDP is more like running your engine at 2,500 or 3,000 RPMs. So that's just an analogy of a situation where in the economy we can overuse our resources, and that is an inflationary gap. So now coming over here, what I want to do is I want to tell you that these two situations here, one of them is an inflationary gap. The other one is a recessionary gap. And I want to see if you can maybe figure out what it is. In fact, if you want to pause the video and try and figure out which situation here, look, here we got real GDP and natural real GDP. And over here we have real GDP on the other side and natural real GDP. An inflationary gap is a situation where real GDP, actual short-run equilibrium, is higher than long-run equilibrium, above long-run equilibrium. And so here, what's happening here is real GDP is to the left of natural real GDP. Now, when a number is to the left on a coordinate plane like this, that usually means that the number is smaller. And so in this situation here, real GDP is less than natural real GDP. But over here, real GDP is greater than natural real GDP. That's what we have here. We have real short-run GDP is greater than natural real GDP, and therefore this is a circumstance that we call an inflationary gap. And visually, this little this space right here, this is our inflationary gap. And I want you to note that. I hope you drew this graph. I want you to note on there that this gap in between natural real GDP and short-run equilibrium, here's short-run equilibrium, here's long-run, and this gap in between, this difference between real GDP and natural real GDP, because real GDP is larger than natural real GDP, in this particular moment, this economy is in an inflationary gap, and this economy is overusing their resources. On the other hand, as we continue in time here, let's go over here to time B. And at time B, if we go up from here, okay, we can see that this is where short-run real GDP is, and up here, that's long-run real GDP. At time B, we can see that that real GDP here is a smaller number than natural real GDP, less than natural real GDP. And so what we said several lessons ago is that when this means that our actual output is less than our possible output. We're not using all of our resources. We're not using all of our resources at all. We're using some of them, but some of them, they're being wasted. Time is going by and we're not using them. We could be using them to produce, but we're not using all of our resources to produce. And this is what we called a recessionary gap. Remember, a gap, an output gap is a difference between a difference between what we could produce and what we actually are producing. And this region right here is, we call that a recessionary gap. Okay, it is a time in the country, a year or a period of time in which output is lower than what it could be, and that is a recessionary gap. And so this is the image that we're talking about there. Here's the situation where, look, here's short-run GDP, short-run equilibrium is to the left of long-run aggregate supply, and therefore actual output right here is less than the ideal output that we're looking for so that we can achieve all of our macroeconomic goals. And so this region right here, this difference between natural real GDP and actual real GDP, that is I'm going to put REC. That is a recessionary gap, okay? So when in an economy, when short-run equilibrium, when real GDP is less than natural real GDP, the economy is in a recessionary gap. Okay? And so, from here, understanding this graph and understanding this graph, here's what we want to understand, is we want to, because we know that we want to be at long-run aggregates or long-run equilibrium, and we know that we're not in long-run equilibrium, we're in a recessionary gap, or we're not in long-run equilibrium because we're in an inflationary gap, we know that both of these circumstances are undesirable. And that's really what I'm trying to get at in this, what I need you to understand in this video, is that these are both circumstances where the economy is in an undesirable state. We want to change something. When we are here or when we are here, we should be unhappy with the state of the economy, because either we're underperforming or we're overperforming, and therefore we want to do something about it. We want to take action. Our economic leaders want to take action to move us back into long-run equilibrium. Well, if this gap right here is an inflationary gap, let me move some of this stuff so it's easier to see. If this is an inflationary gap, and this region right here is a recessionary gap, well then where on this graph, on these graphs, where are we experiencing long-run equilibrium? Well, long-run equilibrium, I'll do that in purple, run equilibrium. Remember we said it occurs where real GDP is equal to natural real GDP, where they're the same. And these two are the same. Remember, real GDP is represented by the black curve, natural real GDP is represented by the orange curve, and they are equal wherever they cross over. And so you can see right here, at that particular time right here, and at this time right here, and at this time right here, and at this time right here. That's 4 times when the economy is in long-run equilibrium. We are neither in an inflationary gap, nor are we in a recessionary gap. Where the business cycle intersects the long-run aggregate supply or the natural real GDP curve, that's when the economy, that's a representation of a time when the economy is in long-run equilibrium. And so now the second part of this lesson, which we're going to move on to, is going to talk about, it's going to pull together this idea of short-run equilibrium that's undesirable because we're not in long-run equilibrium, and it's going to pull together the things that, the determinants of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, and when we might want to move those things so that we can move from a recessionary gap into long-run equilibrium, or move from an inflationary gap into long-run equilibrium. And we'll see that in the next video.